It used to be that if you wanted to understand about a technology solution, that you had to go to people who owned the knowledge on that solution. All of a sudden, on the internet, you could do just about anything. And a lot of our customers know more about our technology solutions than we do. I would say that I was wholly unprepared to do the job when I came into it almost 10 years ago now with this particular company. Even though I had run another business similar to this, understanding the trajectory this company was going to go on was something that, I most definitely didn't have specific experience in. And I was an archaeology art history major in college. So, that clearly didn't prepare me. Well, it maybe did prepare me in some ways, but it's certainly not from the standpoint of the P&L. And so the learning on the job was critically important. And not only learning and listening, but, active listening, really reading between the lines and trying to understand and interpret what it was that was necessary for the next steps and anticipate those things. And I garnered more tools as I went along over the years beyond experience, things like, again, letting the data drive us, and, making those assumptions and hypotheses valid based on experience and on substance.
Yeah, I think that's a really fantastic point. And you're right, reading between the lines. I mean, actually, as a history grad myself, that's a lot of what we used to do.
Absolutely.
You've been a CRO for over 4 years. Now, the average tenure is about 18 months. Obviously, you're a lot longer than that. So really interested to hear, how you stayed in the role so long. And I'd imagine reading between the lines and thinking about where the direction wants to go to, where the direction needs to go to might have helped you with that.
Sure. Well, it doesn't hurt to also be a part owner in the company.
Yeah.
That usually keeps you in the bench long enough. But part of what it was that, 4 years ago, we had a very specific agenda and it was on a 5-year timeline. Uplisting to the NASDAQ was a very important thing on our list, growing the team and the community, increasing our customer base and our reach, developing our product set. All of those things were strategies that we defined day one. Yeah. And so, and not only defined them day one, but defined what the expectation was for them coming to fruition. Yeah. And once you do that, you can define your trajectory much more specifically. I think a lot of times people come into this position with a churn in mind. And a lot of times that's on a very short time frame, as you said. And a lot of times they don't meet the expectations because they're never set properly in the beginning.
Yeah, I think this is a great point as well. I mean, I'm thinking about this from the perspective of you set your strategy, you set your agenda, you set your plan so long ago. But we know how quickly things can change as things grow. So, how did you know that this was going to be the right thing 5 years ago? And how have you kept it consistent today? And have you ever thought of reviewing that? Have you ever needed to review that? And if not, how did you get it right?
We reviewed it constantly. Yeah. I think you create the goals that are almost immutable. Like, getting to the NASDAQ, being a publicly traded company for us was a big audacious goal. It was something that a $40 million company typically does not achieve, especially self-financed. And how we got there changed. The method, the approach that we took changed, but the goal itself was immutable. The goal itself was one that was something that wasn't a moving target necessarily. Creating our customer base and our customer community was a goal that we could have taken many paths, and we did take many paths, through M&A, through non-organic acquisition, and through just simple hard work for sales. But the mix of what it took to get us to that goal certainly changed every day. And frankly, we got up every day and said, okay, we know that the goal is, this far away, and we know what we want to do. Are we still doing the right things to get there fast enough, and with the most efficiency? And that was the question we asked, not whether or not the goal was necessary or relevant. And to be fair, there might have been a couple along the way that we dropped, and maybe a couple that we added, but the ones that stuck were the ones that were important.
Yeah, superb. And it's a really great segue into our theme of data and strategy.
Yeah.
Because I imagine that helped guide you. Now, we're seeing CROs increasingly become data driven, but it hasn't necessarily been that way all the time. And perhaps it's not always the case now. So what's your basic argument for why it's important for a CRO to be data driven?
So the first thing I would say is that data does not provide the answers.
Mhm.
It doesn't provide the answers. What it does is help you understand your assumptions and prove out the hypotheses that you might have against those assumptions. You know, digital and strategic literacy, has nothing to do with being able to read and write. It's about being able to learn and unlearn. And I think the data gets you there. The data helps you with that. And once you are intimate with the data, the subtle nuances in the changes are what are important. It's about exception management, right? It's about looking at what you know is the norm and what you expect will be the norm. And then when that changes, to be able to adjust. And I think that's the most critical thing about data. Data drives us not to give us the open the cathedral doors, and help us understand something new and relevant, but it's about situational fluency. It's about being able to pivot. It's about being able to make those subtle changes that, again, get you to those goals faster and more efficiently.
Okay, so this is really interesting, Andy, because so what we're saying is really data, it shows us not necessarily, are we saying here, would you say that data isn't necessarily predictive? Would you
No,
agree with
it's
that?
not.
Yeah,
No,
okay,
actually,
brilliant.
the predictive part is basing it against the assumptions that
Mm.
you already have. You've already made those choices. What data does is support them or not support them.
Yeah. Okay, that's great. So let's run through this scenario, because this is an interesting topic. I've heard people have really polarizing views on. So other people I've spoken to have said data can be predictive. Let's take the context of a sales team, because if we can analyze our historic records, close win rates, sales velocity, how likely a deal might be to close, we can predict to a certain degree revenue. But we're coming at this from a different angle today, and I'd love to get your feedback on that kind of approach.
It's like trying to predict the weather.
Mm.
You can understand the variables. It's below freezing, so therefore it might snow instead of rain. You can understand those things, and data drives you there, but it doesn't tell you how much snow you're going to get or if you're going to actually get the snow at all.
Yeah.
The data will, again, help you make those decisions, but you already know that you're not going to go out without a jacket, in the cold. And that's a terrible analogy probably, but the fact is, the data, we sometimes put too much and elevate the data too much, because it doesn't speak to us. We're the ones that are still making the determinations. And to give you a good example, use what you were talking about. You have your sales pipeline, you have your funnel, right? You start off with the opportunities, you qualify those opportunities, you boil them down to a prospect, you get to a proposal, and you close the deal. The percentage of your close rate could change wildly. And data might say, hey, all of a sudden, we're not closing a whole lot. Well, is that about the quality of the initial lead? Is it about the quality of the team? Is it about some outside environment that is causing people to have more trepidation about buying? All of these factors come into play, and the data can help us understand that. But the ultimate decision about whether my team is successful or not is right here. All this does is tell me that I need to make an adjustment. And the adjustment is the decision that you have to make. And that's wholly based on experience.
Yeah, I think I think this is actually a really fantastic point. And it makes me think, if data can't be our silver bullet, unsurprisingly, there isn't a silver bullet, there never is. But what have you learned as a CRO, that what core competencies do you need, aside and around from the data, to be able to make those adjustments, decisions, to be able to infer into the data that you need to?
So I don't normally, and I just thought, I didn't anticipate doing this, but I would highly recommend that everyone read the Malcolm Gladwell book, Blink,
Mm.
because it talks about the gut check, right? It talks about the instinctual decisions we make that are actually based on our experiences, we develop those over time, and they're usually right. I would highly suggest that people, think of it in those terms, because again, when I'm presenting to our CEO or our board, and talking about the strategies that we want to lay out, um, I try to do it very simplistically. I do, because um, once you get and really tell the story, because if you do that, they will react in a way that it's going to be very, very straightforward. You get into data, you start, getting into rabbit holes, and providing too much information. Well, then they start trying to see the data as something that can help them get an answer, and it simply is not. They should know where they want to go. Just use the data to reinforce that message.
Yeah, and actually, this is this is exactly what I wanted to ask you. It's interesting, isn't it? Because it would be easy if we could just present a spreadsheet, a graph, telling us where we need to go, and we could just tell people this is it. But clearly, what we're arrived at here is that there's more to this narrative, and it's our job to tell that narrative. Um, so I really wanted to dig into that last piece. If data can't be all we can rely on, um, how do we go about painting a picture to the board of the directions, the story behind the numbers, what's going on in a bit more detail? Because I think it's a good point.
Well, I think you have to. The reason why people like us exist, or why CROs exist, is because we take that information and we interpret it with our own experience.
Mm.
And so I think one thing that's really important to do as a CRO is to present the information with context, but then give interpretation. And understanding that your interpretation might be definitive, you might feel very strongly about it, or you might not. And qualifying that allows the CEO, the board, to make their own interpretation. If you box them in too much, then frankly, you're disregarding their knowledge and their experience. They might come from a perspective that you absolutely don't. So it's really about, and look, I'm a business management consulting firm. So asking more questions is how you get to the answers.
Yeah.
So you have to consider the group, and you have to ask more and more. And then when it comes down to it, from the board's perspective, give them enough to make that decision based on a gut feel that's supported by the context of the data.
Yeah, okay, this is fantastic. So I think we've dealt with the board level, the C level really well.
Yeah.
Let's look downwards across, the rest of the organization. And at some point, strategy becomes tactical on the ground, right? So how do you describe your approach to this key handover, and who's involved in it?
Well, interestingly enough, as you get in our organization, as you get farther down to the ground level, the data actually becomes more and more important in how they tell how they drive their attitude and their business and their day-to-day activities. This is not a revolutionary concept, but when you get down to the very tactical level of, this is an opportunity that we are managing, the data that is provided from our CRM about what a company might do or not do in this certain situation from a buying habit is actually pretty critical to them. Gut feel, interpretation, knowledge is still important, but the qualification process is critical to us. We know our ideal customer, and getting to that point from a tactical level is really critical. Now, we also have a wide product mix. So understanding what the best solution is, and what the best solution, frankly, is for our company and the company, our clients long term, is also a data-driven activity.
See, that's interesting you mentioned that, because a few years ago, what you described might have been described as just being a good salesperson. The art, knowing the products, knowing the buyers, knowing what certain things happen. Now we've arrived at a very different conclusion. So how did we get there as salespeople in tech? And why is the data an important guiding light and not this idea of I know how to sell and I know our customers?
So what critically changed, in my opinion, is that the salesperson no longer was the key holder of information. This happened over the last probably 15 or 20 years. It used to be that if you wanted to understand about a technology solution, that you had to go to people who owned the knowledge on that solution. Not unlike you went to your lawyer or your doctor or your accountant to get that information. What changed is the access to the information at the customer level. All of a sudden, on the internet, you could do just about anything. And a lot of our customers know more about our technology solutions than we do. So your role changed as a salesman from an information giver to someone that was more of a facilitator. And again, just like WebMD and law firms online, and all those things that now are much more accessible to people, that information is no longer sacrosanct to our team. And what that means is, from a sales perspective, you actually have to broaden your approach, because what you don't want to be is just someone who is doing the order entry, right? So you have to add value in other ways, because your information, the knowledge you have on the core application, is not necessarily going to be as valuable to that customer or client. So what you have to do is say, well, look at your situation holistically. Look at what I know about your company that you may not know, because I see it from the perspective of my bench. And that's actually a very important thing for salespeople. They become much more collaborative. We always talk about the consultative sale. We've always thought that we were consultants, in the sale, but now we really have to be, because their expectation of what we should know and how we should, again, open those cathedral doors is much higher now, because there's a lot more information readily available.
Yeah, I think this is great. And I mean, aside from just the data, it does raise an important question: is, given that salespeople need to be more consultative, more knowledgeable, what does this mean for how we run our sales floors? And how do you define a good sales culture in light of what you've just said?
Absolutely. It's become a team sell, a much more of a team sell. And what I mean by that is that you can't have all this based on what I just said.
Yeah.
One person cannot contain all this information, cannot understand all the variables, understand the potential that your solutions can provide in an array of potential solutions and an array of potential companies. We used to be able to, again, get away with that because we could partition what we're doing in a very narrow sense. We can't do that anymore. And selling is not about a one-on-one transaction. It's an ecosystem now. And frankly, how we go and garner our net new customers has nothing to do with the traditional ways that we used to, market to them, solicit them, have them come to us, raise our hands. It's about how we work within an ecosystem. We have not only partners who rely on us, but are economically tied to us. And so their success is bound to our success and vice versa. And because of that, the salesperson has to triangulate, lots of different things. And to do that, you have to have a team. And I think the stakeholders aren't necessarily, people who are employed at your company. They could be people who are, again, those strategic partners. And that, when you talk about that, there's more of an orchestration in the sales process. You're more of a ringleader than you are someone who's holding a bag and just selling software. It's a much more collaborative effort now. And to develop that kind of a interdependency, it takes a lot of work because you have to build a lot of trust. And the team has to be highly trusting of each other. They have to be so comfortable with each other that they can finish the sentence of the other person. And that's a really hard thing to do, but it's something that's very achievable.
It's interesting. I mean, strange question, but do you think being a salesperson today is more enjoyable? Do you think it's more challenging? Do you think it's more important? I mean, does it fulfill more of a service, or would you disagree with that?
Wow, that's a great question. It certainly, I think, has a greater impact, at least from our perspective, from what we do, selling business management applications and software and technology. We certainly have a greater impact on the company because we touch so many more areas of the company. And if we do our job right, we can really change lives. We can really make a company much more successful, make people much easier, make their jobs much easier to achieve that success. So there is on the back end an opportunity for having more of a better customer experience, so that the salesperson feels better about what they do. Does that mean it's easier or more enjoyable? Maybe on the back end, yes. I'm not sure if it's easier. There's a lot more collaboration, a lot more things to think about now. And for some people, that is a very enjoyable thing. They're problem solvers. They want to solve complex problems. They want to look at opportunities from all angles. Other salespeople, that wasn't the goal for a long time. It was, get your target, meet your quota, sell, go home, have a beer. That was the deal. Now it's a lot more comprehensive, and we certainly don't clock out like we used to. That's for sure. And to me, that's a good thing. I'm not about work-life balance. I'm about work-life integration. I mean, I think you've got to do that. And in these days, that to me is a much more enjoyable thing if you can find that.
Yeah, it's great. I mean, what's the impact on coaching? What's the impact on hiring?
Yeah, coaching is again a communal effort, and you really got to pay attention to the trajectory of the person that you're working with, the career opportunity, because again, when you have more of a team effort, there's a lot of different ways people can go. Not everybody should be a solution architect, or should be a lead salesperson, or support salesperson, or sales ops. All of those things come together. And so, early on, it's really hard to tell where someone should potentially go in the organization or what their propensity is. Career coaching is huge. It's a really big thing for us. And it's something that we work on every day.
Yeah, it's great. So bringing data back into this discussion, talk to me about how you leverage data to understand your individual reps or your sales team, or what's happening on the sales floor.
It's absolutely about managing by exception. You have to be so intimate with the data that you're comfortable with the norms. And once you're comfortable with the norms, the exceptions are glaring, right? Even if they're minor. So it's absolutely critical that you can depend on your data, that you have a frame of reference, whether periodically, year over year, or whatever time frame you choose, but that you can depend on what the data is telling you based on trends, and if you see things that are outliers. That's what's critical. So again, trying to find answers in data is a mistake. What you want to find, you already know the answers. What you want to find are the things that aren't adding up to the answers, that are counter to what you expect would be the result. And so, in that respect, data is critically important, to how we manage our business day to day.
Okay. Now here's a question. Part of this actually is I'm really trying to understand this here, and then I'm trying to understand what follows on from it. Looking at you folks, correct me, but I'd imagine you have quite long deals, perhaps deals that have lots of moving pieces. And I was really interested. I mean, some people might turn around and say data can't be as useful there, because data is normally more useful when we have lots of deals whirring through very quickly. They're very transactional. So just correct me on what I got wrong there. Talk to me about how data impacts that kind of deal. I mean, what's the scenario and landscape going on?
Well, there's definitely some validity to what you just said. What I would suggest, though, and I'll give you an example, the pandemic as an example. In March of this year, we were faced with, the pandemic and the potential of, losing significant sales. In our world, you have two kinds of opportunities. You have those longer engagements for the customer, which are 9 to 12 months or even longer, potentially in the millions of dollars. Those are high risk. And then what you have, once you've built that platform for the customer, is the opportunity to make it extensible. So those are much smaller, quicker win opportunities, the add-on types of solutions, the ISV types of solutions that the customers can then get a significant value in a very pointed solution. So typically when you have an economic downturn, which we were faced with in March, I saw this in 2003 and 2009, what you see is the customers, not wanting to be risk averse. They were wanting to be, they were risk averse. They don't want to take on that longer project. That's, they don't even know what's going to happen 3 months from now versus 9, and they're not going to commit that kind of money to it. So typically what happens if they want to still be technology forward is they'll go for the smaller project. But a lot of times you have to have that the larger project first before you can have the smaller project. So our assumption was that we were going to lose a lot of those opportunities, and that our forecast would soften significantly on the larger ones, but increase on the smaller ones. Well, we were right in the second half. It actually increased. But what we didn't see was a softening in the forecast on the ERP. And what that told us is that those companies believed that this was not going to be an economic downturn that was going to be significant for them in the long term. They saw it as artificial, right? In 2003 and 2009, it took 9 or 10 months to get to that point. So they saw the trajectory in their own data of their businesses going down. And so they didn't see that here. They knew that this was artificial, and at some point the lever would be taken off, and they could get back to business. And they actually saw this as an opportunity because they saw that we were slowing down, and then that they were slowing down, that they could actually focus on this kind of an implementation, even though their people might not be in the office, because most of our stuff is remote. So the fact of the matter is we actually saw an uptick there. We saw people being opportunistic and doing that. And when that forecast changed for us, we pivoted. We immediately pivoted. We not only took those smaller opportunities and actually kind of put them off to the side, which is dangerous because you lose those, but focused on the larger opportunities, and it paid off for us. I mean, we were having a fantastic year, mostly because these companies, and again, our space doesn't necessarily deal a lot with hospitality and retail. So those people were not, our customers were not hit, their supply chain. But they still were impacted. Nevertheless, they wanted to move forward. And if we hadn't pivoted, we would have tried to go down that different path, and we would have missed a lot of opportunity.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting, genuinely. I love that.
And honestly, Tom, that is one where, I said, hey, it's your gut. My gut was completely wrong there. Yeah. It was completely wrong. I would have said, never are they going to buy, $1 million 9-month project. They're going to do that. Not in the pandemic. Yeah. Sure enough, the data didn't tell us that, and we pivoted, and it helped us.
Yeah, and that's where the data is useful. Closing question for you: if you were in a room of CROs, perhaps we can imagine the Supermans of the CRO world, the best. What questions would you ask them?
I would really want to understand what they see the future looking like. We're all hypothesizing. We're all making assumptions on how the world has fundamentally changed, and I know it has changed. For us, our remote implementation, our remote interaction with our customers is probably something that's going to stay for a while. But I'd be really interested to hear from other people in other industries, and especially other technology companies. How impactful do they think that will be? How will that fundamentally change our interaction? We generate revenue through our interaction. It's the old sales adage, people buy from people they like. It's hard to get to know somebody if you're doing it in this context. It works, but at some point you want to be experiential. You want to be in the room with them. And we're going to see a lot less of that even after we get past this crisis. And I wonder what their strategy is going to be to approach that. That would be my first question. I think that could take a couple weeks of discussion. I think for sure.
Yeah, that'd be superb. I mean, you're right. I mean, how do you create the human connectivity in this modern world? It's a really interesting question.